Presentation tonight, like I said, is on Hosmer Lake. I'm Kevin Finkenbiner, so I'm a board member, obviously, at the Santiam Flycasters. And what we're gonna so we got together. We wanted to get some more, like Brian was saying, we'd like to get more participation in the outing. So one thing we're going to try. So this is kind of new for us. We're going to talk about an upcoming outing, which is Hosmer Lake. It's one of my very favorite lakes, and when I first moved to Oregon 7 years ago. It was always on a bucket list. I'd heard about Hosmer, and my daughter said, "Do you want to go for a trip to the Cascades?" So we went up and spent a day, and she wanted to go hiking, and I talked her into letting me fish for 3 hours. So I dropped my float tube in at Hosmer, and in 3 hours I landed over 6 fish, 18 rainbows, each over 18 inches, biggest about 2021. I got lucky as hell. I just had the right fly, the right time, and have to understand, I was coming from Nebraska, where there's like 2 trout streams in the whole state. And an 18-inch trout was maybe the biggest fish I would catch. I'd catch maybe one 16 to 18-inch fish a year. And I caught 6 in 3 hours. So needless to say, I've been back a few dozen times. I love the lake. So I'm excited to talk about it. And hopefully, and a lot of us in the club, this is one of our favorite outs. It's bested. We've always had a really good turnout. It's a really fun lake to fish. So with that, I was going to jump into the presentation. So going to go over, this is actually a picture. I was there last week. So this picture is from the fires that Bill was talking about. This was sunset last Thursday night on Hosmer. So that's from the channel. It was pretty hazy. It got a lot worse after that. The lake was obviously open for fishing last week. But so I'm going to spend a little bit of time just giving a quick overview on Hosmer, and then some what I call fishing considerations, what to think about when you're fishing, some different layout of the lake, seasons, and then we'll get into the tactics. So what we do, what I do, and then I'll hand the mic off to others in the room to talk about a little bit what their favorite tactics are. So Hosmer is it's 35 miles from Bend. It's about 170 miles from Salem, if that's right. Sounds like, doesn't seem that long, but it's about a 3.5-hour drive over there. It's on the north end of the Cascade Lakes Highway, which is that's trout heaven. If most of you know that lake, there's Davis on the south end of it, and then Wickiup and Crane Prairie and Elk and Lava. There's a ton of fishing on that. And the Chutes River starts in there. I just went camping on Little Cultus a couple of weeks ago, which is a little sleeper lake. There's a ton of little rainbows in there. It was fun. So there's just a ton of fishing up there. But the gem, in my opinion, that whole stretch is Hosmer. I love that lake. So it's got the 2 campgrounds. So that's where we'll be staying next week. So the south campground is here. That's where the boat ramp is. It's on the south side. And then there's the Mallard Marsh. So the event that we were talking about, so this is where you can launch boats. If you have a drift boat or something, you can launch it there. There is another launch here at Mallard Creek. It's a little, I've got some pictures of it. It's a channel. You can carry a pontoon or a float tube in there and get to a little dock, and you can paddle out into the main channel from Mallard Marsh. And I actually stayed there for the first time last week. It actually wasn't bad. It was pretty easy getting in there, despite what Scott said. So it was, but the camp. So next week, I think there's people staying at both campgrounds next week for the outing. But the picnic that we talked about will be right here next to the boat ramp. I believe in site 21 is kind of the target. So something right close to the boat ramp. So on Saturday when we get together for the picnic, it'll be there. And just a consideration, there's 2 resorts close by. So if you need anything, the Elk Lake and Lava Lake have resorts. So there's a lot of supplies and stuff. If you need anything, there's about 10-15 minute drive to either of them. And then cell phone coverage has been spotty. Now, last week it was great. I have Verizon, and I was surprised. No issues at all. Now that's a first. So I've had issues in the past. So it was really kind of nice being coverage. Now, no guarantees about next week, but it was good. So a few details about the lake. It's very shallow. Its average depth is only 3.5 feet, and it's pretty uniform through a lot of it. The deepest section's 10 feet on the lake. It's 200 acres total surface area. The marsh, it's a lot of marsh around there. So it's completely unfishable from shore. You can't get to it because it's all bulrushes and cattails. So you really need some kind of a floating device. The good news is it's small. And it doesn't get a lot of wind. It's somewhat protected from the wind. So a float tube works fine. You're not going to get blown all over the place like you will on a bigger lake. I still take the oars because I like, if wind does come up, it's nice to not have to kick my way in. But they do allow trolling motors. So electric trolling motors are allowed. So you see quite a few of those on the lake. Putzing out the electric, no gas engines, so it's all electric. The lake is at 5,000 feet. So last Thursday morning, that was a really hot day. I think it was close to 100 degrees here in the valley. And it got hot later in the day, but when I went out at sunrise, it was 40 degrees when I launched my boat in the morning. So it was a wake up. It was pretty chilly out there. So so get ready for some, bring your long johns next week. And then absolutely bring your camera. It's gorgeous. Now, last week with the smoke, it was a little disappointing, but there was smoke. I could see snow on South Sister still, and it would, but with the haze, it was kind of hazy, like that sunset picture showed. But when it's clear, it is phenomenal. You can't see real well from the campground, but when you get out on the water, you've got complete views of all of South Sister, Broken Top, and Bachelor. And we're late enough when with some of this moisture coming in, we're probably going to have snow on the higher elevation. So it's going to be gorgeous next week if we get some clear skies. So bring your camera. As far as fishing, the lake itself is open year round. It's fly fish only, catch and release for all species. So something that's kind of a misnomer though, being open all year, because it freezes up by middle to late October, and it ice out isn't until late April, middle of May sometimes. I went up there, I think it was like 3 years ago, and I pull in the parking lot, and I'm thinking it's like late October, and there's nobody there. And this is great. I'm gonna have the lake to myself. And I come up over the hill, and it's completely iced over. So it was pretty early, and it had been, I guess, they had a couple of cold nights up at the high elevation. That was enough to freeze the lake. So because it's not very shallow or not very deep, so it will freeze up. But you do need a recreation pass to fish the lake. The $5 daily use fee, or I you know have the senior pass, so I get the lifetime senior pass. So that works. And so does the Northwest Forest Service pass. But you do need to park in the parking lot or launch a boat. You need that. Or if you stay at the campground, you're fine. Just keep your vehicle at the campground, as long as you pay the campground fee. So, in my opinion, the best fishing is early and late in the year. So right after ice out, and now to ice out, the fish are really active. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is, I'll talk about in a minute. There's a lot of boat traffic on the lake in the summers when it's warm. But the fish right now are really active. There's a lot of active insect activity right now. They're fattening up for the winter. The spring, you get some really nice bug hatches. It's a really good caddis hatch I've hit a few times early in the year. It's fun, and you're not fighting with all the stand-up paddle boards and kayaks. The most of the catch is rainbows and brookies. They originally, that lake, 20 years ago, was known as an Atlantic salmon fishery. So they stocked, and at the time, if you go back, I doing research for this, I was reading some old articles, and they talked about how the state stocked Atlantic salmon and brook trout because neither of them reproduce naturally. And so they just continued to stock them. Well, they haven't stocked the Atlantic salmon since 2015, I think. That was when they ended the Atlantic salmon stocking and just stocked rainbows. And I think before that, they didn't stock any rainbows at all. But they also stopped stocking brook trout. Now the brook trout are still there, and there's a lot of them. So they're obviously reproducing in the lake, because they haven't stocked brook trout in at least 10 or 15 years. So there's occasionally you'll catch a cutthroat, and I have never caught one. I know Tim has caught one. I know, so I was talking to a guy the other day that caught one. On Thursday, he caught a couple, he said. So I personally have never caught one. I'm not sure how they got in there. I meant to call it NFW and see if they ever stocked them. I didn't know they stocked cutthroats at all in the state, but I thought they were all wild. But somehow there are some cutthroats in there. The Atlantic salmon, occasionally, I caught one about 2 years ago. I don't know if there's any residuals. The one I caught was really nice. It was 22 inches or so. I didn't know what it was. It had a big hook jaw on it, but it was a really neat fish. So there's still a few around, I guess, but they're probably pretty few and far between anymore. They do stock the lake. It was stocked in July with 750 legal size rainbows. And what I understand is they stock it once a year is all. So, and the plan is they've already announced the plan is again to stock it in July with 750 legal fish. So anything what's, I guess, legal, anything above 8 inches. So there's those, so DFNW does support it. Like I said, bank fishing is not possible. I think I covered most of this. So what you see here, this is like a very light traffic in that canal. On a really hot day, it's amazing how many, this water is super cold. and there's nothing but swimsuits out there. I don't know. I guess they never fall in the water because I wouldn't want to even think about falling in the water. It's cold enough with wearing waders, but it's solid. It can get really, really crowded. Even last Thursday at noon, the parking lot was full, and there's hardly any. There's a couple of people fishing. Most of the people are kayaks and paddleboards, and this channel can be really good, but when they're all heading between the South Lake and the North Lake. So we'll talk about that. You know, on the map you saw the two different lakes. So there's two different channels. They all put, almost all of them put in at all of the stand-up paddle boards put in at the boat ramp, and they all go to the North Lake and come back. They all go through the channel. So that's can be a little annoying. So usually during the middle of the day, I don't like fishing the channel. The channel's a lot of fun, but it can be a pain with all the boats running through there. So Hosmer is like a spring creek. It really is. It's just because of all the marshy area that it has. The water super clear, and it is a spring. It's fed from a spring. So Quinn Creek runs in from the north, and that actually is a underground. It's lava rock. So it just like the start of the creek. I've never been up there, and I guess it's a neat hike. There's a waterfall up there too, but it's hard to get to from the lake, as I understand it. And there's actually a parking lot. You drive around by Sparks Lake, way up past the lodge, and you can come in from the other direction. It's a better way to do it. So someday I'm going to actually go up there and hike it. But the creek comes out of, it's like Metolius River. It just comes out of nowhere and starts flowing, and it's ice cold water. And then it flows into the north end of the lake, and then it fills this big marsh. So there's all weeds and bulrushes and cattails and all kinds of weeds and stuff, and there's bugs just hang out in there. So there's really prolific insects. So there's a lot of midges, a lot of damselflies, dragonflies, water boatmen. There's just a little bit of everything. There's a phenomenal calabatus hatch when it gets going too late in the summer. Can be a lot of fun. So but that makes it like a spring creek, and because the water's really clear and the fish see a lot of stuff, they get really picky, and they do get a lot of fishing pressure. So I tend to use pretty light tippets. I usually have a 5X or a 6X if I'm going to a midge, or I've used 7X too if I go to small midges. But I tend to run pretty long leaders and pretty fine tippet on the water. If I'm throwing woolly buggers, sometimes I'll go 4X, but never. I don't think I ever go any bigger than 4X at Hosmer. Recommended rods. I use a lot of 4 and 5 weights on the rod. I find that to be a nice size. And then I typically, I'll talk a little bit about the techniques I like to use, but I usually fish a couple rods. I usually have a sinking line and a floating line, because what I find, the fish get super selective, and and I think maybe, in my opinion, the presentation is more important than even the fly sometimes. I remember fishing with Beth a couple of years ago at the outing, and I'm fishing, paddling around the South Lake, and she's like, every time I look over, she's hooking up a fish. So I call over, I go, "What are you using?" She's like, pheasant tail. So that's what I got. So I had a pheasant tail. So, and I kept fishing it, and she's got not 10 more fish or something crazy, and I haven't had anything. So I called back over again, and I was using a floating line with a beadhead pheasant tail. So she said, I'm using a hover line with an unweighted. And I didn't have a hover line at the time. I switched over to an unweighted, and I actually started picking up a few fish, but it was amazing that the same fly, I did catch a couple fish with the floating line, letting it sink, but I think they were hitting calabatus, and I think what they wanted with that bead head and the floating line, the fly would sink, and then you'd strip it, the fly would rise. Where at the hover line, it would just go straight through the water like this, and that made all the difference. So by not having the right presentation, so I was screwed. so it's kind of, so anyway, I need to say I got a hover line, and that's what I fished the other day. I used my floating line and the hover line. And then occasionally I'll use a heavier sink to get deep, but again, the lake's only 10 foot deep, so you don't need a real fast sink or a heavy sink line to get down there. I use a lot of woolly buggers, a lot of leeches, chironomids. I like fishing. I watched a guide one time in the channel fish. He had a bobber, like a thingamabobber, and his client was catching a lot of fish. And that water's so clear. But what I noticed though, they were on a chironomid. And the nice thing about chironomids on the lake, it's not deep. So a lot of bigger lakes, when you're fishing chironomids, trick is finding out where the fish are feeding. Are they in 5 feet, 10 feet, 20 feet, whatever the depth is? You've got to get the right depth in. They're never going to hit it. You don't have to worry about that so much at Hosmer because it's all 3 foot deep. So you just put your chironomid 3 feet below. And I've had better luck doing that with like a dry dropper. So I don't get the splash. Now I was watching the guide. He had this guy catching a lot of fish, but I also noticed that they'd cast, and then it was a while before the fish they caught anything. So that bobber would have to sit there a while. I'm not that patient, so I want it to be there, and I want to be on fish right away. So I like doing that a lot in the channel, and I do a lot of dry dropper. If I see rising fish, I'll put a dry dropper on. Try to if I can, especially if I don't know exactly what they're taking, which is quite often. So a little bit about the lake, a little more about the lake. There's really 3 parts to the lake. There's the South Lake, which is where the boat ramp is. So this is actually a picture of me getting in my float tube on the South Lake. So there's a concrete launch pad there to drop. You can put drift boats and stuff in there on the South Lake. So you can back your boat in and back your trailer in and take off there. So a few key things about the South Lake. It is the warmest part of the lake. So the cold water comes in from Quinn Creek on the north. So that's really cold water. And the north is always a little colder than the south of the lake. So early and late in the year, this tends to be when things cool down. The South Lake tends to fish a little better than the North Lake. When it's hot in the summer, then that's when I start heading up the channel, up into the colder water in the North Lake. So I like to fish the South Lake early and late, which is kind of now. So like next week, I'll be spending most of my time here and in the channel. I did go up to the North Lake last year, and it was pretty much a wasted trip. I think I caught 1 fish, but I've been there in the summer, and it's fantastic. You gotta be. If the fish aren't there, they're not there. So what I like to do when fishing the South Lake, I like to generally start with the edges. So I'll cast towards the bulrushes and strip back. And what I do a lot, I vary my speed a lot on the strip. So until I find fish. So unless there's rising fish or something obvious that they're hitting. So if I'm just searching, I go out and, cast in the bulrushes and change my speed and try to find out something that works. So I typically start with a woolly bugger. Sometime, and I usually have 2 flies. So I have a woolly bugger and a soft tackle or a calabatus type thing, depending on time of year. And I'll strip that back and vary the speed. So there's been times when that woolly bugger, when I cast and stripped it as hard as I can, and that's when they'll hit it. And I don't know why, because there's nothing moving. There's no damselfly moving 20 miles an hour through the water, but they'll at times they'll hit that. But so that's one of the things I do a lot is change my speed to try to find out what they're wanting, what they're hitting. And then when there's a lot of times when I'm just exploring too, I'll just throw the line out there and kick around the lake and try to find them that way too, if they're not hitting along the shore. So sometimes they cruise more to the middle. There's a 10-foot deep section on the South Lake. They'll sometimes sit in that, and it's sometimes just to just paddle around the edge of that and find fish. I think Ken does that quite a bit. I see him paddling around out there all the time. So he'll talk about his techniques in a little bit. But the South Lake is kind of where most of the people fish. And then, but the channel is also really, really good. This is the boat ramp at the channel. That's Scott. They're getting into the, I guess it's a boat ramp. It's a dock. But so that you can see that this is kind of, so the channel's actually back here. So that's the channel. This is just the access to the channel from the Mallard Marsh campground. So it's a little bit of work to get through here. This was kind of pretty overgrown the other day. And a lot of times you're oaring through the bulrushes to get out there, but it really wasn't bad. And it puts you in a really good spot. Actually, this spot out here is actually quite good when you get out in the channel. So the channel is, it's about a mile long. So it's about a mile between the South Lake and the North Lake. So it's maybe even a little more than that. It's a pretty good road to get up to the North Lake. But it's completely weed free in the middle. So you can go right down the channel and get there. It's and what's really neat about the channel, you'll see fish all the time in there because again, that water is super clear, Spring Creek. So you'll see big brook trout, and there's a lot of brook trout in the channel. I catch more brook trouts in the channel than anywhere else. The rainbows tend to be more in the South and North Lake when they're in there, but the channel is full of brook trout, and some of them are huge. I had a salmon-sized brook trout swim under my boat a couple of years ago. It was 6-7 pounds at least. It was absolute monster, but of course he wouldn't think about eating anything, but he was a gorgeous fish. But so it's kind of frustrating to see him. But the and I just learned something from talking to Tim earlier tonight. There's a side channel here. These side channels are pretty good. And I guess there's a dam. I've never been all the way back on the one side channel, but there's a dam back there that's on the outlet of the lake, I guess controlling the lake levels. I've never been all the way back there, so I need to do some more exploring. I thought I'd seen the whole lake, but I'm missing that. So I'll check that out. I guess there's pretty good fishing back there, according to Tim. But the channel can be a lot of fun. And I really like, now the other day, I was catching them on woolly buggers in there. I've had really good luck in the past with midges though, and small mayflies in the channel on a dry dropper. And I think that I like, because the water's so clear and those brook trout just kind of cruise. I think just having the dry dropper, it's been really effective for me in the past up there, fishing that. So I like zebra midges and ice cream cones work really well. And then the North Lake. So the North Lake is really pretty. It's pretty shallow up there. It's like I said, it's about a mile row. So it's a bit of an effort to get up there. In the middle of summer, it's 90 degrees for a few days. That's where the fish all head. They head up this way. And there's when you're there, it's kind of hard to describe, but there's actually a color ring around the lake where there's a little drop off, and the fish will cruise that little drop off, that color area. So that's the place you want to fish when you're in the North Lake. And I've had really good luck in there. That landlocked salmon I caught or the Atlantic salmon I caught was there was midges hatching. He hit it. It was on a dry dropper. He hit a little like 22 or something crazy on a dry dropper in that zone. So what I was doing that day, there was rising fish, and I was just casting the rising fish with a dry dropper, and almost everything hit the dropper, the little midge dropper up there. But that can be a lot of fun. But that color change is really what you want to key in on the North Lake. Like I said, I was up there last year, and it was dead. Now there's in the springtime, there's a really good caddisfly hatch on the lake in the spring, and it kind of moves with the temperature. So it'll start in the South Lake and then it moves north. So right after ice out. So sometimes this North Lake, even though it's kind of early in the year, can be really, really good if that caddisfly hatch is coming off. So I got lazy one year and didn't go up there. And I was talking to the guy I was fishing with, and he hammered him up there with the caddisflies. It was kind of slow on the South Lake, but at any rate, so there's, kind of need to follow where the fish are and where the hatches are. So there's the three different, so it's really three different lakes in one is kind of the way I look at it. So what do I do? So this is, my techniques here. So I typically, so I'll just go what I did last week when I was out there on Thursday. So I got out there about sunrise or sunset Wednesday night, camped. I stayed at Mallard Marsh, and I had my boat ready to go in the morning. So shortly after sunup, I was launching. It was 40 degrees, like I said. So it was chilly. So I rigged up my dry line, and I was just doing some searching. I was exploring. There wasn't anything there was nothing moving. There's no bugs. I could see where there'd been a midge hatch the night before because there's dead midges on the surface, but there's nothing obvious that they were hitting, no obvious fish activity. So I put on a beadhead on my floating line. I had a beadhead woolly bugger, and I can pass these around. These are the flies I was using last week. If you want to pass those around. So I had the floating line, I had the beadhead woolly bugger, and kind of an olive and brown pattern that I like. And that, by the way, that's what's in the raffle too. That was my donation to the raffle. But so I started with the dry line and the beadhead, and I was on the bottom, and on the tag I used that soft hackle on the top. So it's a hare's ear soft hackle that I like. That's a size 14. And I caught most of the fish I caught were on the beadhead. Now I didn't see, which is a little unusual, I didn't see a single damselfly the whole time I was there. And I typically think the woolly bugger is a damselfly imitation the way I fish it, because I kind of strip it back. And sometimes it works with that floating line, and sometimes it works with the hover line or the sinking line better. And so I ended up that during the morning not fishing, not even using the wet line, the sinking line. I fished everything with the dry. And I pretty much stuck with the woolly bugger and the soft hackle, and I caught probably 2/3 of the fish on the woolly bugger and about 1/3 on the soft hackle. So they were hitting both. Mostly brook trout. I did land that morning about 9 o'clock. I landed a 21-inch rainbow. It was a beauty. Really, really nice fish. Football, just fat as all get out. Is one of those big crane prairie type rainbows. Is a gorgeous fish. It was a lot of fun after tying in a bunch of little brook trout, 10, 12-inch brook trout, and then have him hit. It was pretty exciting. So it made for a good morning. So I fished till about 10 o'clock, and then I didn't see any insect activity, so I didn't do anything different. So I was technically working, so I went back to my camper and made a few phone calls and worked on my computer for a bit. And then I went back out fishing about 4:30. I was back on the water. And I started with the dry line again, just like I was doing before, and it was nothing. I fished for a half an hour, didn't get a sniff. So I switched over to basically the same setup. I put like I learned in the past, I used a hover line with an unweighted woolly bugger and then the soft tackle. The soft tackle I never weighed. I used whether the line or the bead to sink it. So that right away, I mean, immediately I had 3 fish on the soft tackle. And I also noticed there was some caddis, some little black caddis coming off, but there's no surface activity at all. So I was thinking at the time, this is going to be great because I'm going to hit this hatch. I'm ahead of the hatch. There's really going to get going. They're going to start being surface activity. Never happened. And then I caught like, I think 3 or 4 fish on that soft tackle. And then for some reason, everything shifted and started hitting the woolly bugger. So I hardly ever used, I did throw the dry line a little bit that night and I didn't mix it up. There was very little surface activity. It was really quiet night. It was kind of weird. Because I really expected there'd be some caddis or something coming off at night, midges or something, but nothing ever happened. I fished till way past dark, like I do, and got up the water. It was really black. But I did pick up a few more on the soft tackle late. But there's from it's like early and late is when they hit the soft tackle. In the middle, they were all hitting the woolly bugger. So not really sure why, but that was fine. And again, I didn't see any. I saw there was a lot of dragonflies, so I don't know if they thought they were dragonflies. Don't know, but usually I contribute that to damselfly, and I didn't see any damselflies at all. So and then so a lot of times if there are hatches on the water, I look for. There's a really good, like I said, there can be a really good calabatus hatch. There's a couple different colors of catabatus. There's like a lighter phase and a darker phase, and like a lighter hare's ear will do the lighter phase, and the darker phase is more like a pheasant tail. So it's good to have both of those available if you get the calabatus. And then if the midges, a lot of times I'll fish if it's, like I said, the dry dropper with a snow cone or a zebra midge, um, for techniques. So that's kind of how I approach the lake. Any questions for me, and then I'll.
Soft tackle onto the, are you tying the soft tackle on to the shank of the hook trailing, or are you tying it a head dropper?
No, when I do the dry dropper, or I do everything I do. I'm a Euro guy, as some as you know. I do everything with the tag. So I do with the Euro type tag. So I tie an Orvis knot, and I do so I tie the bottom fly is on the end of the line, and then I do the Orvis, connection or Orvis tippet knot, and then I run the tag off the Orvis tippet knot. So I do that with a dry dropper too. So I don't do anything. I've had too many times when I've had the line off the hook bend and I feel like I'm missing fish because the line gets in the way of them hooking. So I like having the separation. So as long as you keep it the somewhat short, you don't want a real long tag of the tangle. So if I keep it, 3-4 inches long, I don't have the tangling issues. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so what we were talking about, so Scott is next up. So Scott, so I asked, I asked for, how do you fish the lake? I wanted to get tactics from other board members because a lot of us really like fishing the lake. Everyone's got a little different approach to the lake. I thought was kind of interesting. Scott likes fishing the channel mainly. He likes Mallard Marsh. He likes camping down there, and he fishes a lot of damsels, and then he uses a second fly and a dropper too. So maybe you can talk a little about what you're doing.
Back a picture too.
Go back a picture.
Yeah. Back.
Back.
No, back.
That's you though.
Back.
Oh, you don't want to look at you? That's me.
There. Good.
Right.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to point this out. This is my son. He goes fly fishing with me basically once a year at Hosmer because he's head of maintenance on Enchanted Forest. So he gets 0 time in the summer, like 0. So when we go up there, it's like, woohoo. Having said that though, he doesn't cast at all. and he kills it out there. So you think, man, I got to be this suave caster? Forget it. What he does is I set him up with usually I'm very into midge tips. That's what we're using, and dry. I don't use weights on my midge tips. I think an unweighted fly works better. I don't know. So what he does is he'll just put it out there in the channels and just start slowly going. Got another one. Got another one. So it's a type of lake where you can go in there and you don't have to be the great fly fisherman. So that's all I do. I set him up, and then it's, he has his own guide basically, and I don't get anything out of it. No money, nothing, but his company. So we go up there, and the last 2 years we've been up there, it's been smoky as all get out. And I'm not sure about this year. We're going up Monday, and if they won't let us fish, then we're not going to stick around. So I'll text somebody, let you know. And so hopefully, I don't know if you go up there and there's a sign that says no fishing. Is that it? Or
I don't know.
because if I don't see the sign, right? But anyway, we always fish at Mallard Marsh, and we always go out at that egress there, which is, you saw the little channel we go through. It's what makes it nice is you're right in the middle of everything. So more or less right in the middle between the two twin lakes. And we always fish, I don't fish the lakes hardly at all. It's the channels 90% of the time. And like I said before, we use midge tip lines. He has one, I have one, and then I'll give him like a balance leash on an indicator, and he control that, and that works great too. Yeah, and I troll too. I mean, there's sometimes I'll pull up, on the channels, you're not going to be whipping the if you're smart anyway. You'll end up with your line in the cattails, but you can sit there. What I'll normally do is my son and I will go together, and we'll just he'll be there and I'll be here, so I can keep in contact with him. Throw your line out there, and all you can do, you can just pay it out if you want and just start. And I think part of his success, he's really patient about it, and he's not going fast, that's for sure. And I think it's the matter of just getting the flies down to the fish and letting them see it. And then we've done, where I go in and there's that other arm that goes off. I've been down there a few times, and it's, yeah, the one that goes all the way the other way. Yeah, we've caught some fish there too. It's not a bad place to go. And that's about it, except for me personally, it's not a early morning fishery. I've never had a lot of luck. Maybe it's because I've got a hangover or something, because we're playing cribbage till 10 o'clock at night. But any questions as far as, I guess my point is, you control that lake, especially in the channels, and you'll do just fine. So you don't have to be this, like this guy, he wants to, strip really fast, right?
I've never had luck trolling.
Seriously. Wow. Well, I need to talk to you. Anyway, any questions? Thank you.
Good.
Do I get to keep this?
No, no, it's mine. Yeah, no, it is interesting that the different techniques. Because I personally, like I said, I've trolled the channel, because I've tried trolling all the way to the other lake and maybe picked up 1 or 2 fish the whole route. So it's kind of nice to know that I need to learn some more stuff. So it's all good. Ken. So Ken's where is he? There he is, hiding in the back. So this guy, I've fished with him a bunch of times out there. Every time I look at him, he's hooked up. It seems like he's always got a fish on. He's always in the South Lakes. He's always paddling around out there in the South Lake, and he's always got a fish. So I want to hear so let's hear what Ken's got to say.
Yeah, I just like to see a little bit more water than Scott likes to look at the same stuff all the time. I've also, one year I actually kicked my float tube all the way up there to the channel, and I realized there's actually a current coming out of that upper lake, and it's impossible to kick my float tube up that thing. So anyway, I fish the lower channel because I like more water to fish, and I don't like to compete so much with the paddle boards or stuff like that. And I use my float tube. I cover that lake quite a bit out there. I'm able to catch a fair number of fish. I might not catch the 40 or 50 little tiny ones, but I catch the bigger ones down in the lower lake. So anyway, the nice thing about having a little bit more water to fish is you can use any variety of methods. I kick quite a bit, but you know, you can also, if you get tired of kicking, put on an indicator or cast and strip. You can cast and strip up against a lot of weed beds rather than the same one. So yeah, it's a pretty good place. Fly selection, leeches, buggers, same thing that Kevin uses there. Calabatus is really good. Chironomids, if you get tired of kicking. But anyway,
That's it. Good stuff. Thanks, Ken. Yeah, what is fun about going to the club too is somebody finds a fish. Like my story with Beth, she's catching fish like crazy, and we all talk. So when somebody finds fish, if you go with the group, you're going to get on fish because we'll help you find what's working because everybody's trying different things. And I think it was a couple of years ago, Ricky was out there and all of a sudden he was small, he's yelling out there, go small, go small. They're hitting small stuff. And sure enough, we all went down to like 18s and 20s and started catching fish. But because that's what makes the outings really fun when that kind of stuff happens. So next up is Tim. This is his brother. This is Tim's brother here on the picture. So Tim, that's a nice crane bow. So unfortunately, Tim doesn't have a picture of a nice crane bow of himself to show, but
So I love Hosmer. Mostly I love Hosmer because of fish like this. And there's a lot of fish like that in there that you can run into from time to time. All you have to do is catch one of them and you're going to be coming back for the rest of your life, right? I like Hosmer also because you don't have to even be that good of a fisherman to catch fish like that. I'm not tactical like a lot of the fishermen we have in our club. We're blessed to have in our club, like Beth and Kevin and Ricky, who are always trying the newest technology and the newest technique. Although I did finally get a hover line that Beth was touting for a while, and it did serve me well in that lake because before I got that hover line, I was either using a floating line or an intermediate. And you wouldn't think an intermediate would be a problem, but it does limit the waters you can fish. And so now I fish with usually a couple different rods and 3 different lines. So I don't know it in terms of secret flies or techniques. I don't really have any. I do like to fish the channel like Scott, but I don't do it during the middle of the day when the paddle boards are in there in good numbers. Usually what I'll do is I'll try to get on the water shortly after dawn and get up into the channel. It usually takes me about 20 minutes to get up into the channel. There's a section from the South Lake that goes up quite a ways before it turns. And that section is pretty wide open, and I have found some just gorgeous fish in there. Usually I'm just either throwing with my floating line to a soft tackle, or sometimes I'll put a small, for some reason, my soft tackle is always a size 14, but when I put on that pheasant tail, it's got to be 16 or 18, it seems like. And having that as the trailer and just casting it out into some good waters, what seemed like they'd be holding waters along the edge of the weeds, letting it sink down a little bit and stripping it. Oh my goodness, it can just be wonderful. Or with an indicator doing the same thing. But I also like fishing that South Lake. During the middle of the day, it can be long stretches without any fish, but as the sun gets lower, the fish will venture out, and it can be just one fish after another and pretty good sized fish. So another thing that's fun about fishing that lake, I think, is the damselflies. The damselflies are thick in that lake, and you hear stories about fish jumping out of the lake to catch a damselfly in flight. I've never been good enough. I've never been lucky enough to witness that, but it happens at that lake. I've heard stories. So a carry special or a 6-pack would also can also be really good. I also like it, especially closer to dawn or dusk, cast to the bank. and let it sink a little bit and strip it, because sometimes they're just laying along that edge of the bank. So that's my story.
Tim or Beth or somebody, I only have an intermediate line. I do not have a hover line. Can you explain the difference to me or any others that really don't understand what the difference is and why you cannot use an intermediate in place of a hover?
I was going to speak next anyway, and I was going to start off by talking about that because I do have, I'm sort of a stillwater specialist and I do have my favorite lines. Intermediate lines is supposed to sink about an inch a second or something like that. A hover line is designed to sink below the surface and then like a half inch a second. It just is really, really slow. And I've had, I call it my slime line, my clear intermediate. That's great for fishing 6 feet deep, but this lake is too shallow for that. The advantage of especially a hover line in particular is to keep the flies horizontal as Kevin was talking about, which is a lot of times what the fish want to see, that this horizontal movement. The other time it's really useful is in the wind, because if you have a floating line on and the wind comes up, it's going to blow your line. It's going to create this movement. You're going to have a big belly and you're going to have trouble setting the hook. So I will often switch over to hover line just because of the wind. And the midge tip line, I really like midge tips. I know Scott likes it a lot. A midge tip is a floating line that has, it's anywhere depending on your which brand you go, a 3 foot to 7 foot, usually intermediate tip. And the principle of that is if you have an indicator, you've got your floating line coming up, you've got an indicator, and you've got this hinge where the indicator is coming down like this. And so the indicator moves, you have to get that, you have to straighten out that hinge before you can actually set the hook. And so that the idea about the midge tip is that you've got this gradual turn. And sometimes it's a little more difficult to detect the strike. If you wait for the feel of the take on the midge tip, you're going to lose a lot of fish. And you want to watch the very end of the line before it dives underneath. And if it starts to dive, or if the wrinkles in the line starting to straighten, you don't wait for the feel of it. You just set the hook. So anyway, those are all the great lines that you use for a shallow lake, which is what this is. Yeah. I'll repeat the question. So the question is, can you, instead of going out and buying a midge tip, can you put a poly leader on the end of a floating line? Absolutely, but you have to make sure it is a slow sinking poly leader instead of a medium sink or a fast sink, because the poly leaders come in a different sink rate. So you can absolutely have a hover line, midge tip line by adding a poly leader on the end of it.
So Tim does have, he said he has no secret flies. He has one unsecret fly that he uses like 90% of the time. It's an orange soft hackle. So it's partridge and orange. So at any rate, he said he didn't have a secret fly, but he does. So I asked, like I said, I asked everybody to give, some thoughts about their favorite fishing. Everybody sent me like 5 bullet points. Beth sent me 14 slides. So I'm going to hand the mic to Beth, and hopefully we get out of here tonight sometime.
Tim's brother a couple of years ago, I told me, he said, did you know you have a nickname for the two of us? I said, what do you mean? He says, yeah, we call you the professor. And I was like, not like I'm an overachiever or anything like that. Some of what I'm talking about is just sort of basic stillwater tactics and specifically to the fall fishing of this lake. But a lot of this is, how do you fish a lake? And for me, it's, you look at the hatches and you fish the hatch, and the hatches have timing to them. And whether early in the year the Calabasas hatch starts at noon, and as it gets later, sometimes it gets earlier and earlier, then gets later and later. You find out when the hatch starts. It's pretty much going to start the same time every day that week. From week to week to month to month, it might change. And so this lake, it's big on Calabasas. So I break it down to before the Calabasas is going to pop off. And believe me, the hatch starts about an hour before you start seeing the flies, the duns coming off the water. So before it, how do I fish? During it, how do I fish it? Afternoon fishing, everyone tells you it's slow. A lot of times I'll just go in there and tie flies or take a nap or read a book or whatever. And there's the fishing of dusk as well, which I have, because of my experiences there, have completely changed how I fish right before night. So go ahead and move it in. So before the Calabatus hatch, there's a couple things you look for. Midges are really good in that lake year round because it stays cold. And very rarely do I catch midges with a dry fly midge. There's a couple times. I've had some fantastic success. There's a midge that in the afternoon will just sort of buzz along the surface of the water, and it's barely touching the surface, it's skimming back and forth. It took me a long time to figure out that these fish that are leaping out of the water, trying to catch this thing, we're going for this. It was about a size 14 or 16 midge. And I had at one time tied up some elk-haired caddis, and it just did a fast hand twist retrieve and had some violent takes. But otherwise, most of your midge fishing is going to be pupa. And, absolutely right. You put it in your indicator. Kevin's absolutely right. They splash down with regular indicator, and then they'll scare them away. I like to use a New Zealand indicator. And if you don't know what that is, that's a yarn. It's actually wool indicator, and it casts really nice. Doesn't really tangle much, but when it lands really soft, as long as you don't smack your leader down, your fly line down. And it's very, very sensitive. So just at least bit a little of a nibble, it'll have a movement to it. And I will often fish 2 flies. You have to be a better caster for that, so you don't tangle. But I'll put my first fly about 2 to 3 feet down, and the second fly about 4 to 5 feet down in this particular lake. So pupa forms, I bought my midge box here. If someone wants to take a look, I can point out the ones that I like. A lot of times, the hare's ear and the bird's nest. Well, no, let me go back. Sometimes you'll see this longhorn caddis, and I have a picture of it here. It likes to be in the channel. And if you see surface activity in the channel before you see any calabatus coming off, they're probably going for this longhorn caddis. There's a dry fly called a Goddard caddis that you can use, but I just like stripping soft tackles during that time that I see that kind of caddis activity. And in the channel, just to mention it, in general, this lake doesn't like beads. I agree with you on that, except for the brookies in the channel. Brookies in the channel seem to really like the gold bead of a ribbed hare's ear. Sometimes they just absolutely beat that up. So go ahead and move on. So the other thing I like to do before a calabatus hatch is balance leeches. If you haven't done a balance leech before, you can see that the tip of that top fly is just a bead, and then at a right angle to that is your eye of the hook. That is a special way to tie it. If you don't know about it, come ask me about it afterwards. I have a whole section of balance leeches in my box that I like to use. This is one of forget whose pattern this is. The chart, the gold in the orange tail is particularly useful. I find it really seems to attract them. The other thing that if you see any surface activity before you're really getting the duns popping off, there's probably a spinner fall going on. If you look at the picture of the calabatus right there, that's a spinner. And the way you know it's a spinner is the tail is very light. The wings are mostly clear except that front edge is dark. And so you want to imitate that with a dry fly. Emergers are not going to work, but if you see surface activity, that's the other thing to look for. So early hatch, let's see, I know the calabatus start coming off the water at about 11. Just throwing that number out there. About 10, I'll switch my techniques over to fish for that. And the way that the nymphs surface is they are living down on the algae and their bodies decide they're going to hatch. And what happens is they build up gas underneath the carapace. And you can see the sparkliness in here. That's gas that's going into the nymphs don't have any choice at this point. They're going to hatch that day. And either they wait till they get full up enough and then they rise, or some of them will struggle and they'll try to swim down and they'll sort of have an up and down kind of activity. But it starts about an hour before you start seeing it. So I'll have a nymph pattern and either pheasant tail or a hare's ear or a soft tackle. And I will let my, let's say, hover line descend further. Or sometimes I like to actually troll a midge tip line, and I'll even troll with 3 flies, about 2 feet apart or 3 feet apart in the deepest part of the lake. And with the tip being a bead head, and I'm fishing multiple levels, and I'll use one of those as a nymph pattern at that point as well. Okay. So early in the hatch, they're going to be lower. As it gets close to the hatch, you're going to want to be more water column. It's not as important in this lake since it's shallow, but for a deeper lake, it actually can make a big difference. So the flies that I like early, pheasant tail, that's a bead head one. Mostly I use unweighted. I just sort of threw that in there. The hare's ear. The thing about the hatching of the nymphs is the wing case gets really dark when they're mature and getting ready to hatch. A light wing case can be at any earlier stage. So sometimes this is a trigger. And this articulated pheasant tail, I did really, really well on it. This is June. I was fishing 3 flies on my midge tip, and just having that on, didn't matter which position, outfished all my other flies like 3 to 2. And that was one of my fly of the month patterns I did a month or 2 ago. So I like to fish that mostly with the hover line. So that's a calibrator's done. And you'll notice the difference between that and the spinner. They call that the brown speckled mayfly. So you can see that when you see that on the surface of the water, you know that the hatch is going. And the question is, how much surface activity are you seeing? And when you see enough fish coming to the surface, switch over to either an emerger or dry fly pattern. When I talked about rise patterns that distinguish, I discussed that extensively in Calibrator's article that I did a few months ago. That was like a 12-page article. I spent a lot of time on that. Talked about how to identify the difference between, an emerger take and a surface take. If you see bubbles after the fish is left, he's taking the surface. If you see a porpoising without bubbles, he's probably taking under the surface. And it can make a difference on where you watch for and how you use the pattern. So this is my favorite dry dropper pattern. The point fly is the dry fly, and the dropper is about 3 feet between the dry fly and me. And the reason I like this is this keeps the dropper, which doesn't necessarily have to sink, it keeps it closer to the surface. And the other thing I like about this setup is if I have the dry fly out there and my dropper has started to sink, maybe it'll bring my dry fly a little bit closer to me. If I strip the line in, that dropper will start rising and it can imitate an emerging insect. I like to use soft hackles in that kind of configuration. And I put on there the fluoro tippet. Usually when you have a dry fly on, you want to use nylon tippet because it doesn't sink as much as fluoro does. But I really think, especially when the water's really, really still, that you want to sink that last foot or two, because the fish will actually be able to spot it. You can actually get a rainbow kind of changing colors that come off of a surface line that doesn't happen once it's sunk. So I like to use that kind of configuration there. And I like using the Orvis tippet knot. I think I've talked about that before in some of my articles. I just talked about it. Midge-hatch calabash fly, extended body foam pattern. I have a box that's devoted to it. That's a pattern that I developed because I got so frustrated that specifically the fish at this lake would not take my dry fly. And so I spent 4 years trying to come up with a dry fly that could actually fool those fish. And you have to fish the fly in a way that it's doing natural things with the wind. But my current pattern is working pretty good. It's kind of fussy though. Parachute Adams is a really good choice. The CDC Fluff is a pattern I've really started going to. The CDC will hang it right in the surface. Even if it sinks, it'll still more like a soft tackle. I like that is the dropper fly, and then my foam pattern is the point fly. And Kent told me about the mallard covert style soft tackle. And so I had never heard of a covert. It turns out the very end of the wing right in here, these are the coverts. And the front of that wing, I could probably get about 15 flies off of that to be the right size. But the nice thing about a soft tackle made from a mallard covert, it really looks like a cripple. And so at the end of the hatch, you want to have a cripple pattern on. Having that as my dropper, sometimes I'll switch over and pick up a lot of flies on that soft tackle covert soft tackle. So late hatch, there's still some surface activity, but you're not seeing as much. They're probably at that point going for the cripples. Or they might be going for a spinner. So late in the hatch, the covert spinner patterns, Parachute Adams. Afternoon fishing, if I'm getting boring, like I said, I'll go in. But sometimes I mentioned the ovipositing midge happening in midday. Sometimes they're going for damsels. That's not as much this time of year. It's a little late for that. And it is spectacular there with the damselflies. It's in July. And yes, the fish leap out of the water. It's extremely exciting. There's damsels flying everywhere, and you won't take your fly because you can't make your fly around and imitate anything. It's really, really frustrating. And what I found is using a damsel dry and just fishing right next to the reeds on the edges can be effective. That's the only thing that seems to work. Yes, it's spectacular, but it's really frustrating. So afternoon fishing, besides that, I do trolling woolly buggers, I do trolling nymphs. Balanced leeches under an indicator tend to work pretty good. I agree fishing edges, or I like to troll the deep parts with the 3 flies that are my midge tip. I do that quite a bit. So the story that I discovered with the caddis in the evening, I went to Hosmer. It was about 5-6 years ago, and I used to always go for Labor Day weekend because, as a doctor, if you don't work, you don't get paid. It's a 3-day holiday. So for years, probably 10 years, I went every Labor Day weekend. And the first weekend that my son was old enough to stay home and I could go alone and fish all day, I went up there. And there were a lot of bad fires that year. In fact, they even had a 1-lane road to get up over the pass because the fire was right up next to the highway. I didn't even think about, is there fire at Hosmer? I just, I always go, right? So I got there late. It was after dark and I was in site 10 and I didn't see a single person. I didn't really think about it. The next morning I wake up and I'm getting my coffee and this ranger's driving. I sort of wave at him and he stops. And he said, "How's it going?" I'm like, "It's fine." He said, "Did you know you're the only person in both campgrounds?" I'm like, "What?" And I still didn't put it together. I'm like, "Really? Is anyone else here?" He says, "Well, the gate's going to be across the parking lot. And it's going to look like it's locked." He says, "Just push it open." It's like, "Oh, okay." So I went down there. Sure enough, the gate was closed, and I pushed it open. And I drove in there, and there was nobody on the lake. And so I put my pontoon in. And I started rowing out. And I'm like, "There's a Pumas boat. Is that 2 miles away? Is that 3 miles away? Wait, there's another one over here." There were 2 of them within a few miles. I'm like, no wonder why there's nobody here. And it was absolutely fantastic fishing. I think I saw 3 people all day, and I got off the water I'm used to, going in at 5:36 or 6:30 and making dinner for me and my son. So I'm getting off the water and there's this guy coming in with this pontoon or float tube. So I wave at him. And the next day I get off in the middle of the afternoon and I go tie some flies and the guy stops by my RV. He says, "Oh, well, you should have stayed last night. There was this really great cast hatch." I'm like, "Really? I've never had a lot of luck with cast. I take my everclear cast and I throw it out there and it sits there and the fish just ignore it." He said, "Well, I was talking to the fly shop in bed and they said strip a soft tackle." And so I said, "Oh, okay." And I tied some up. And he said, "Did you know we're in a level 2 evacuation zone?" I'm like, "Well, what's that? What's that mean?" And he's like, "Well, that means you get ready to leave in a moment's notice." I'm like, "Really? I can't leave. The fishing's too good. I caught 30 fish the previous day. I've never caught that many fish. I'm not going to leave." So I slept with all my clothes on and all of the blinds up in the RV. And I kept waking up every 2 hours and looking out. And then the smoke changed direction the second or third day, and I couldn't even see the ramp. But I was like, well, every time I heard this car coming down, I was like, "It's the ranger coming down telling us to leave." But it didn't, and the fishing was fantastic. But that first night that I went back and stayed, it was incredible. It was like the surface of the water was boiling with this sedge hatch, and there were white flies and there were black flies. And I got to bite every other cast when I'm stripping the soft tackle. I had hook up about every 4th or 5th cast. I pulled in a dozen fish in an hour. Never had such good fishing before, but I always put it in black soft tackle right when it's going below the trees, and I strip it in. And I like to use a hover line for that because I think it helps to keep it more horizontal. I think that particular sedge actually dives down to lay its eggs. When I took the entomology course from Rick Hafley, where he says some of these ones, that's when you catch them. They're not so much hatching out, but they're going down to lay their eggs. So putting a bead on there, one of those I have has a small tungsten bead, letting it drop and then letting it strip back up can be very, very effective. So I think that's my last slide, isn't it? So any questions? So the question was, how do I deal with the paddleboard? Yeah, I had some people said that the best thing that they liked about the day was me directing traffic. And so, yeah, I watch when they're coming and I'll sort of set up my line, and a lot of times I'll set up so they can go behind me, and I'll say, "Can you please, go behind me?" And I try to warn people, they don't know that fly fishermen have a back cast. So a lot of time I try to politely say, you have to say something if you come up behind me, because I've got 3 flies on and my back cast is 40 to 50 feet. But set up to one side, keep an eye out. So they'll say, "Hey, can you guys go this way?" If I'm trolling sometimes on the channel, and they can be very, very effective, I'll sort of keep an eye on things and I'll sort of be on one side and I'll just have them point to the other side. Any other questions? Okay. Yes, I'm an overachiever.
Thanks, Beth. Yeah, no, that's the caddis that was coming off last week. There wasn't a ton of them, but I'm hoping we get a better hatch next week. But there's definitely these were definitely in the area last week. So, and this is just the latest fire map. This is from Deschutes National Forest. So the Hosmer Lake is right. This is the boundary here for the fire. That's Highway 90 or the Cascade Lakes Highway. So it's just to the east of that is where the line is. So it's the Hosmer Lake's right on the edge of the fire zone. So hopefully we'll get the rain. Then we won't have to deal with it next week. So with that, any last questions? Any other comments, questions? If not, we'll.
I gotta think what it was called. The paddle boards that people come. How does that affect the fishing? The movement of their thing?
Yeah, we definitely call it the paddleboard hatch. I don't find that they spook the fish a whole lot, especially in the channel. They're always seeing them going back and forth. I think in the lower lake and in the upper lake, it can move them around a little bit. I didn't mention when deciding on lake fishing in general And any especially shallow lake, looking for nervous water to decide where you're going to cast can make a huge bit of difference. And nervous water is when the fish are moving their tails on the surface, has some ripples in it. You can see, and the fish may not even rise, but you can look over and you can say, okay, I can see the fish over there and coming this way. And my next month's article, I'm doing something different. I'm actually filmed nervous water at Klamath Lake, and I incorporated some clips that I narrate into my article. So, because it's something I think it's really important for lake fishermen. It's a very important tool in my toolbox. You have to have someone sort of show it to you when you teach yourself. Anyway, let me know if you like this article, but watch it. I think it'll really help.
So any other questions or? Okay, I think with that, we can wrap things up. So I think